Britain's power and influence has declined since the beginning of the century. And the question is this a trend we can reverse?
We are concerned with making money. That is what we are trying to do.
It's been described as the most beautiful terrace house in London.
The abuse of business and financial power.
You lied. We shall have a harder Christmas than we have known since the war.
Economic activity is best left to the private sector, with market forces being encouraged to operate.
Come with us, then, towards the next decade. Let us together set our sights on a Britain where 3 out of 4 families own their home, where owning shares is as common...
During the election of 1987, Mrs. Thatcher celebrated an economic boom, created, she said, by the power of the free market.
A Britain where there is a resurgence of enterprise, with more people self-employed, more businesses, and therefore more jobs.
But 5,000 miles away, in the Mexican jungle, an old tycoon brooded. He was James Goldsmith, and he had been pushed aside by the boom. He now believed that Mrs. Thatcher's government had lost control of the economy. They had been taken over by the power they had unleashed, the force of the global markets. And that night, as Mrs. Thatcher rode to victory, another embittered tycoon sulked in his London house. He was Tiny Rowland, and he too had been marginalised by the onrush of the economy. Rowland believed that the Conservative Party had been corrupted by the boom. Both these men wanted vengeance for their loss of power, and both now set out to destroy the Conservative Party. And they would be joined by a third vengeful tycoon who had been cast aside. He knew that the government had become corrupted by the growing power of money. All these men had helped to bring the markets to power. But now they wanted someone to reassert control over the monster they had created. But what they got was not quite what they expected. In the early 1970s, Goldsmith and Rowland had been glamorous, powerful figures. The Conservative government, led by Edward Heath, had created a boom by pumping money into the economy. The stock market soared ever upwards, and the new tycoons used the power this gave them to take over some of the biggest companies in Britain. They were seen as men who would create a new, prosperous Britain. When Goldsmith took over the giant food company Bovril, he ruthlessly sold off any part that didn't make a profit for the shareholders.
They were going to rejuvenate British business that was moribund, and Britain too. They were bringing a new dynamic of ruthlessness that was necessary to clean out some of these businesses, get rid of, indulgences, you might say, in businesses, work for the shareholders, and people were believing it. Shareholders were believing and getting on the coattails of these people. I think there was a fair amount of massaging of paper and the proliferation of paper in these takeovers, which cost many people a great deal in the long term.
But back then?
Back then it was seen as a renaissance of British business.
Now, this is Mr. Rowland. Mr. Rowland and Amini wa manjamu.
Tiny Rowland was doing the same in Africa. He was taking over the old British-owned companies that had once dominated the empire. Rowland used ruthless methods to build a vast industrial empire. This included bribing the new rulers of independent Africa. They were methods that shocked the merchant banks in the City of London. And his bank, Warburg's, resigned because he was uncontrollable.
I think his determination was fully matched by his corruption, and he was utterly ruthless. The ends to which he would go to achieve his broader objective, I think were a great deal further than anyone else. That I always found quite worrying. I never felt that he and we would have the same ideas as to where the cutoff line was.
But then, in 1973, the tycoon's brief moment of power was destroyed. The stock market crashed disastrously. The Conservatives' boom had turned sour. It had led to inflation and industrial violence. And in November, the Arab oil price rise pushed the market over the edge. It fell further than in the crash of 1929. The politicians now turned on the tycoons. When Rowland's corrupt methods were revealed, Edward Heath publicly called him the unacceptable face of capitalism. And Goldsmith was now seen as a greedy spiv who had torn British industry apart to make himself a fortune. He left England to go and live in America. It was also the end of the idea that politicians could control the economy. Ever since the war, governments of both left and right had believed that they could manage the economy by varying spending and taxation. But now, the chaos produced by the Conservative boom overwhelmed the new Labour government. They finally admitted that they had lost control of the economy.
We used to think that you could spend your way out of a recession and increase employment by cutting taxes and boosting government spending. I tell you in all candour that that option no longer exists, and that insofar as it ever did exist, it only worked on each occasion since the war by injecting a bigger dose of inflation into the economy on every occasion, followed by a higher level of unemployment as the next step.
Tell you what I don't want to see.
What's that?
Labour in power again.
Labour in power? Was that the Marx Brothers?
No, another bunch of comedians.
Coming shortly, the Conservatives.
In 1979, Mrs. Thatcher was elected. She believed that all attempts by governments to manage the economy were doomed and led to disaster. The crash of 1973, she was convinced, had been created by Heath's attempts to control the economy. Instead, she was going to give up power and let the free market operate with as little regulation as possible.
I think a great deal of the idea of the power of the government was illusion. It was perhaps true in the 19th century. It was no longer true in a world becoming increasingly globalized. One has to give up trying to control. One of the first things we did, and it was a very significant one, was to get rid of exchange control. Remember, still in 1979, you had to get permission to change more than small amounts of money into other currencies, because we were trying to control the price of sterling. It always failed. And from there on, we realized that it was the way to go, to de-restrict, to deregulate, and to let the market operate.
When the Conservatives removed exchange controls, they opened Britain up to the growing force of the international financial markets. Money could now move in and out of the country at will. It meant that the bankers in the City of London were now free to raise huge amounts of money from anywhere in the world. They could then use that capital to finance the buying and selling of hundreds of companies. And in the process, the bankers, not the politicians, would change Britain.
When exchange control came off, suddenly the floodgates were open. And we realized that we were actually going to go through a period where change was going to happen. And we were in a position to make it happen. And we were the only people in a position to make it happen. And people like myself saw that you could do things which before had never been done because of those restrictions. And now they were gone. The world was the oyster to play with, to finance, to arrange finance, to take over.
15 years before, when the tycoons had been buying up companies, the banks had played a minor role. But now, the banks were in charge. Now, they targeted old companies and financed entrepreneurs who then bought them up. Factories were sold off and thousands of workers were sacked. Everything was done to increase profits and maximise the return to the shareholders. It helped to fuel a growing boom on the stock market. It was the ruthless reconstruction of British industry by the power of the market.
I think they saw the opportunity to make large amounts of money. That's what they saw. Because unshackling capital just gave them the freedom that they wanted to do essentially whatever they wanted. They looked back to a golden age of capitalism when there weren't any uppity unions, when there weren't Labour governments that wanted to prevent them from doing all the things which they'd traditionally done. Then you can create boom conditions. They set out to reconstruct it.
But then, into the midst of this boom, came a very unwelcome ghost from the past. Tiny Rowland. Ever since the crash of 1973, Rowland had been shunned by the establishment. But now he saw in this takeover boom an opportunity to restore his reputation and to make a great deal of money. And the way he was going to do it was to take over Britain's most famous department store, Harrods.
Harrods represented respectability and a very excellent commercial enterprise. Everyone looked up to Harrods. People were coming from overseas to shop there in the name of Harrods, and it promoted the owner of Harrods. It was something which he felt would in fact achieve one of his aims, acceptability.
But Rowland was not acceptable to the merchant banks. They were running the takeovers, and he was the sort of entrepreneur they knew they couldn't control. He also represented a seedy and corrupt past, the unacceptable face of capitalism, which they wanted nothing to do with. They were different. They were the new enterprise culture.
He was the sort of person who was seen to be, thought to be involved in corrupt ways, and ever since the Edward Heath statement in Parliament about the unacceptable face of capitalism and that sort of thing, he was seen to be, in the words of 1066 and all that, a bad thing. Unreliable character and questionable motivation. An inappropriate owner of such a crown jewel. Couldn't trust the fella.
The banks did everything they could to stop Rowland. They persuaded the government to refer his bid to the Monopolies Commission. One of the few other companies that Rowland owned in Britain was a firm that made nylon bedsheets called Brentford Nylons. The Commission argued that if Rowland bought Harrods, he would then have a monopoly on the sale of nylon bedsheets in Britain. So they blocked the bid. It was an absurd ruling, but the government accepted it.
Well, I thought it was totally absurd. And the city press thought it was totally absurd. And Tiny thought it was that the true motivation was they didn't like him. And nothing would persuade him after that the true reason was not the reason given, but simply a matter of personal animus. They didn't want Tiny to have House of Fraser.
Rowland knew that he had been stopped because of his corrupt past. He was furious because to him it was the height of hypocrisy. Rowland knew that underneath the new shiny enterprise culture there was a growing mass of corruption. Corruption on a far grander scale than anything he had indulged in.
I became a fraud squad officer sort of about 1980, 1981. And within a very, very, very short space of time, I became utterly amazed at the level and the degree and the volume of fraud that we were being asked to investigate and uncover. At a time when this climate of enterprise that had been unleashed by the politicians had just really started to get into its stride. Wherever you looked, there was this tide of sleaze. But of course, nobody thanked you for bringing this to the fore. Nobody wanted to discuss this. We saw avenues of investigation being blocked, prosecutions not being proceeded with, the Director of Public Prosecutions not proceeding with certain kinds of prosecutions, using the phrase, well, it's not, I mean, sometimes they would say, well, it's not in the public interest. There was this enormous sense that as long as the markets are given free rein, we don't want to do anything that would be seen to stand in their way.
All of us in politics have dreams. It's part of mine to give power and responsibility back to people. Popular capitalism is a crusade to enfranchise the many in the economic life of Britain. And that is the kind of society I want to see.
Politics became compromised by the power that was unleashed by the new climate of enterprise. Thatcher and Tebbit had seen this sort of road to the New Jerusalem through freedom of markets, and had unleashed it and had let it loose without, I think, without realizing the kinds of all the sort of dangerous and damaging spin-offs that would happen.
But then suddenly, the Thatcher government came face to face with one of the other effects of deregulating the financial markets. And this time, it was an effect they couldn't ignore.
25, 26 the market, 25, 26 the market at the moment. What's the market?
At the end of 1984, the government faced its first big currency crisis. Speculators on the international markets began to sell pounds and buy dollars because of high interest rates in the United States. There was nothing the government could do to stop them, and they watched helplessly as the pound slid to almost $1 on the foreign exchanges. And then it got worse. The richest man in the world, the Sultan of Brunei, announced that he was going to shift £10 billion to America. Mrs. Thatcher faced disaster. She turned for help to the Sultan's representative in London. She sent her private secretary, Charles Powell, to see him.
Margaret Thatcher, during the crisis, she knows that the Sultan of Brunei is a friend of mine. Charles Powell coming, he me several times in my residence in Park Lane. Please, can you help us, because we're going to take the reserves, about 10 billion sterling, to one of the American banks. Can you help us? I took the plane, I stayed 2 weeks begging the Sultan. He accepted. I came back, called Charles Powell, he came to see me. I said, it's okay, the funds are not going to be moved. He was so happy. And then he said, Margaret Thatcher is very grateful, and please, in the next visit, when the Sultan comes here, you are invited to have a chat with her to Downing Street. I say, fine.
Mohammed Al Fayed now became an influential figure. He was invited to dinner at number 10. Fayed had made his money out of the oil price rise in the 70s. He had been a middleman, arranging enormous contracts in the Middle East. But now, in the new unstable world of global currency flows, British politicians needed someone like Fayed. He had a new kind of power, the power of international money.
It would be very hard to think of Mr. Macmillan, Sir Alec Douglas Hume, even I think Edward Heath, giving Mohammed Fayed the time of day. They wouldn't even have received him as number 10. The imagination boggles at the idea that somebody of Mr. Al Fayed's, what shall we say, background would have had the red carpet rolled out for him. Now suddenly, a person who can be of assistance in adjusting the pressures of the financial international community on a sovereign government becomes, in a way, a player in his own right. He becomes somebody who makes the wheels go round, and you either let him down there with his lubrication, or perhaps you hit the buffers.
And Mohammed Al Fayed now claimed his reward, Harrods. In early 1985, he made a takeover bid, and a grateful government waved it through without a murmur. Fayed paid £570 million in cash. The government did nothing to question where the money came from, or even whether it was legally his. They accepted the guarantees of an eminent merchant bank, Kleinwort Benson. The bank also had no idea where the money came from. They accepted Fayed's assurances that it was legally his money, and in turn, they received a huge fee.
I think Fayed was dishonest, and he succeeded in making those elements in the establishment permit themselves to be used as tools through greed and lack of scrupulousness. I think it showed that here is this outsider who should have had every disadvantage, was able by the manipulation of monetary forces to get to the very top, helped and aided by senior city firms who should never have done anything of the kind.
Tiny Rowland now swore revenge. He was furious that Fayed had got the very thing that he wanted. He saw it as evidence that the Thatcher government was now at the mercy of the forces they had unleashed, the powerful global markets and a corrupt city of London who would do anything for money. He wrote Thatcher a letter accusing her of corruption and announced publicly in the Times, "I will not go away. You will see me in your dreams. You will need to take 2 Mogadon rather than 1 to get to sleep at night." In June 1987, Mrs. Thatcher was triumphantly re-elected for a 3rd term. But almost immediately, Britain was hit by an economic crisis that was to turn yet another ageing tycoon against her.
Good evening. It is a day that will be in bold print in history books. Black Monday, October 19th, 1987, when the stock market went into a free fall.
The crisis began in New York. A wave of panic swept through the stock market that shares, which had risen continuously for the past 4 years, were overvalued. A contagion of fear infected the world's markets. The next morning, when the London Stock Exchange opened, it immediately fell by 20%.
The sense on the floor, on our trading floor, it was doom and gloom. It's the end of the world. That was the big phrase. The end of the world, mate. This is it. Blood on the street. It was total sense of helplessness. There's nothing anyone could do. You can't control billions and billions of dollars worth of money. If the markets think the market is going to go down, it will go down. Governments are absolutely powerless.
Governments watched helplessly as the crisis rolled around the world. One after another, stock markets crashed. To many, it seemed as if governments, like Mrs. Thatcher's, had, through deregulation, created a force that was now overwhelming them. One of those who now became frightened was James Goldsmith. Since the crisis of the 70s, he had lived in America. He had made a fortune, asset-stripping corporations and manipulating the markets. But now he decided that the very thing that had made him rich had become a threat to world stability.
I think our financial system is extremely fragile. I think that you can see it in the way the volatility of currencies. You can see all sorts of weaknesses. I believe that the politicians, unthinkingly, have created a situation, a structure, whereby our financial system is dangerous and could create great problems for the real economy.
Goldsmith now gave up business and retreated to the remote Mexican jungle. He used his fortune to begin building a vast private estate. He specifically designed it to be a self-sufficient community. It would be a world under his control.
Mexico was his dream, but like other dreams, there's also a reality that often conflicts with the dream, and things happen that weren't supposed to happen. Sometimes the bottling plant for the water got contaminated, or sharks got into his private beach and had to be chased away with dynamite, or the mosquitoes couldn't be controlled ecologically by being eaten by birds, so they had to use DDT. That's not what he wanted. What he wanted was a perfect biosphere where everything lived together in harmony. It was the golden age, going back to a time in history where we didn't have all the problems.
Goldsmith's estate was dominated by an enormous domed palace on a cliff above the ocean. Around it were houses for his wife, his past wives, and his mistress. The estate was guarded by an army of ex-SAS soldiers. They were organised by Colonel David Stirling, Goldsmith's friend from his time in Mayfair in the 60s. Goldsmith's views became more and more apocalyptic. He began to see everything, from AIDS to mad cow's disease, as products of a global economy which the governments had lost control of.
His brother brought up to him the danger of mad cow's disease. He suddenly saw this as this another part of his apocalyptic world where mad cow's disease would break out because cows, as he pointed out, their hoofs were used in making all the gelatin caps on all the pharmaceutical products. So even if you were a vegetarian, you might wind up, and so he became very concerned with this.
But things didn't go the way Goldsmith feared. The global economy didn't collapse. In fact, within 18 months, it had bounced back. The boom started again, driven upwards by a frenzy of speculation around the world, and no one quite understood why. But it was an ideal time to do takeovers, and Goldsmith was tempted out of retirement to try for one last deal. In 1989, he returned to London to announce a bid for the giant British-American Tobacco Corporation. The old asset stripper was going to do what he had done so many times before: break it up, sell off large parts, and make himself a fortune. He called it liberating the company.
It is taking companies which are being stifled under the bureaucracy of a large conglomerate and liberating them.
The men whose support Goldsmith needed to succeed in his bid were the anonymous managers who ran the pension funds. But this time they refused to back him. The truth was that they were now so powerful they no longer needed people like him anymore. Over the past decade, the pension funds had grown enormously, and they now dominated the stock market. Through it, they owned over 70% of British industry. Their one and only aim was to increase the returns for their pensioners. In the past, they had always backed raiders like Goldsmith because they increased profits by sacking workers and selling off anything that didn't make a profit. But now, the pension funds had learnt they could do this themselves.
We showed to the pension funds you could increase the returns to pensioners. If you sacked 1,000 workers and you got rid of their salaries and wages from the profit and loss account, it would have a dramatic effect on the share price. Share price could go up 3 or 4 times, which is all the pension fund is interested in. And they did it for a purpose, which was to increase the income to the pensioners. And so the pension fund industry were the final arbiters. If they didn't like what you were doing, you wouldn't succeed.
The pension funds discovered they could asset strip companies themselves without the need for takeovers, because they already owned the majority of shares. And they now proceeded to do this throughout British industry on a vast scale. They closed factories and downsized thousands of workers. The resulting devastation was irrelevant to them, because the only thing that mattered for the pension funds was the increased return for the pensioners.
They went on because the only thing at the end of the day that mattered to a pension fund manager was the share price performance. I'm afraid the morality of what lay behind it was a consideration that certainly wasn't uppermost in his mind.
Do you blame the pension fund manager for that?
Not directly. I think it's an inevitable consequence of a free market, rather than to attribute specific blame to pension funds.
So the pension fund managers had also become trapped?
By the free market mechanism, yes. Yes.
So was anyone in control of this process by now?
No.
James Goldsmith went back to Mexico, defeated by a corporation that was more frightened of the pension funds than it was of him. In his anger, he now turned on the politicians. He became convinced that they had let loose something that had gone out of control. The markets, driven by the big institutions, were devastating society, all in the pursuit of an ever higher share price. Goldsmith conveniently forgot that this was exactly what he had been doing for 30 years.
If, purely for an economic doctrine, you have a situation whereby the economy grows, but you create poverty, unemployment, and you destabilize the society, you're in trouble. Look what's happened in the last 50 years. You see, people are not willing to look at fundamentals. When I was a boy, we were taught that irreversibly we were moving towards progress.
Yes.
That material wealth, material prosperity would solve our problems, would improve our way of life, and improve our civilization. And what have we done? We've destabilized our society. We've increased unemployment massively. We've totally destabilized our cities. Therefore, something must be wrong. And what has become wrong is that instead of the economy being there to serve us, we are there adoring, serving economic industries.
All right.
But meanwhile, the boom just carried on growing. The vast amounts of money flooding out of the City of London helped to create a consumer boom. And riding on the crest of this wave of money was the new owner of Harrods.
And also a very special guest, someone I want you to make yourself feel at home here, Chairman of Harrods, Mohammed Al-Fayed.
Has it been a good day so far?
Wonderful, wonderful. We hope, I think we're going to make £10 million a day.
It's
£10 million a day?
Today, £10 million we start, and we have £100 million of goods. And fantastic bargain.
How was Richard Gere? Was he okay?
Was fantastic. I tried to get him here, as a matter of fact, but he preferred to go to the
surrounded
bed.
by people.
No, he preferred to go to the bed departments because we have the greatest collection of hamsters. And he focused.
I really don't know what you're talking about.
No, not at all.
I'm absolutely baffled here.
Mohammed Al-Fayed was now a rich and successful businessman. He epitomised the enterprise culture created by the Conservative government. He had also been accepted into society. Harrods sponsored the Windsor Polo Championships, and Fayed presented the prize himself to Prince Charles. There was only one problem, though: Tiny Rowland. Rowland wanted vengeance. The chairman of Rowland's company was Sir Edward Buchan. He was a Tory MP, and he was continuously attacking Fayed in Parliament, calling him a liar and a crook. So Fayed decided to fight back. He employed a lobbyist, Ian Greer. Fayed paid Greer to get MPs to defend him in Parliament.
Yeah, they put questions in the House of Commons. If somebody put question against me, they answer these questions and put also my side of the story. You fight fire with fire, I told you.
Did you pay them money?
Of course, of course, of course. How can they do the job for me? Of course, free? No. This is their fees, right? Greer being paid, and they are paid, plus they asking for so many things. And this is normal, practices. If someone asks you to give him something, to do something for you, fine.
The world that Greer took Fayed into was a hidden one that he and a few other lobbyists had created. They had turned politics into a business. Greer represented scores of large corporations and newly privatised companies. All of them wanted to exert pressure on Parliament. And Greer knew that in the new climate of enterprise, MPs would be eager to help, provided the companies offered them favours in return.
I played a major part in making sure that commercial interests were better understood by government ministers and members of Parliament. For that, I make no apology at all.
But in the process, you
in the
placed
process,
temptation in the path of MPs.
in the process, expectations were raised, perhaps by me unconsciously, perhaps by my clients, that there is a honeypot here, and you can partake of that. And I think that this culture certainly demonstrated itself in the behaviour of some members of Parliament who did take advantage of their position and did become greedy. I think Neil Hamilton is a prime example. There are many others.
Fayed did what Greer's other clients did. He gave MPs like Neil Hamilton favours in return for questions. He also went further. He says that he gave MPs cash, although Neil Hamilton denies this. In the process, Fayed, along with Greer's other clients, was transforming the very nature of politics. The politicians had created a vast boom through deregulation, and the lobby industry had become a mechanism for feeding the fruits of that boom back into politics. Politicians wanted to cash in on the very thing they had created.
They want to go in political life to cash in, to be member, advisors to companies, member of the board of companies. They bullshit people to cash in. And you see all the previous member of parliament or ministers, they are directors in major oil companies, directors in banks, they cash in.
Politics had become a business. Once the Thatcher era was in full swing, if you asked a new Tory MP, can you help me on this? He would say, what's in it for me? I want a directorship and 12,000 quid. I've got to send my child to a private school. So that there became a new cash nexus. The nature of politics changed.
The lobbyists found it easy to buy MPs, not just because politicians were greedy, but because increasingly they were disillusioned. They knew that power had shifted from Parliament to the City of London.
It is a direct result of the diminishing of power of the Member of Parliament today compared with 20 years ago. There is an attitude that recognizes they haven't got the power that they used to have, and says, we've got to take commercial advantage and every other kind of advantage of the period that we are there. And the power's gone. What else are you going to do?
But Tiny Rowland would not give up on his vendetta. He knew that the government had commissioned a report into the Fayed's takeover of Harrods, but were refusing to publish it. So Rowland then did what he was best at. He bribed an official and got hold of a copy of the report. And then he published it. The report said that the Fayeds had lied about where their money came from. To many it meant they should never have been allowed to buy Harrods.
Good evening. An official Department of Trade report says the Fayed brothers lied repeatedly to the government, the Office of Fair Trading and their own board during their successful bid to take over the House of Fraser store chain, which includes Harrods. But the Trade Secretary, Nicholas Ridley, told the Commons it would not be in the public interest to disqualify them from being company directors.
The government's refusal to do anything caused a scandal, and Mohammed Al-Fayed and his brothers became despised figures. They were attacked in Parliament as crooks and thieves, and the MPs he had paid to defend him said nothing.
A great many of us, both inside this House and far more, I think, outside this House, will feel astonished that he is not now going to take action to disbar those directors of the House of Fraser who have been so seriously criticised in his report.
They have obviously perjured their background, and if they and that they should be deported as undesirable aliens. We don't want them here. They're crooks.
Mohammed Al-Fayed retreated to the castle he had bought in Scotland. He was furious. He had been dropped by the MPs he had lavished money and gifts on, and he was being attacked in Parliament for being corrupt. To him it was gross hypocrisy, because he knew that many MPs were just as bad as he was.
I just really felt betrayed, completely ungrateful bastards. You can just imagine that people can behave like that. I'm a major investor, I'm a major employer. I have 30,000 people working for me. 30,000 people, right? How can they do that? These are the people, because they're trash of the trash, right? This is the problem. And these are the people who are the people elect and put in power. It's just devastating. You can't just see how great country like that, with great history, with great civilization, you can just go find yourself ruled by a bunch of crooks, and people have no moral, have no ethics, have nothing.
Fayed was angry because he was rejected by a society which he knew
was doing much worse things than anything he'd ever been accused of, and criticised for doing things which he felt were happening throughout the Conservative Party. People were taking money for arms deals, that government ministers were engaged in corrupt practices, and that MPs were taking money to perform favours in Parliament. There was an increasingly corrupt relationship between Parliament and business, which allowed business to bend Parliament to its will.
In 1990, Mrs. Thatcher was forced out as leader of the Conservative Party. She was succeeded by John Major. He saw himself as a strong man who was going to reassert control over the markets. Above all, he wanted to prevent the damaging fluctuations in the value of the pound. His solution was to take Britain into what was called the exchange rate mechanism. The value of the pound was fixed to Europe's strongest currency, the Deutschmark. It would no longer be at the mercy of the currency speculators.
All my adult life, I've seen British governments driven off their virtuous pursuit of low inflation by market problems or political pressures. I was under no illusions when I took Britain into the exchange rate mechanism. I said at the time that membership was no soft option. The soft option, the devaluer's option, the inflationary option, in my judgment, that would be a betrayal of our future at this moment. And I tell you categorically, that is not the government's policy.
The currency markets decided to take on the British government. They deliberately set out to force John Major to devalue and to leave the exchange rate mechanism. It was to be a defining battle over who really now controlled Britain's economy, the government or the markets. The markets also knew that if they succeeded, they would make a fortune. They began by selling billions of pounds on the foreign exchanges.
It was incredible. I mean, obviously you can hear what's going on in the market, and you can hear wave after wave of selling hitting the market, being met with resistance and support by the Bank of England. They were buying such a phenomenal amount of pounds.
The only thing the government could do was to tell the Bank of England to raise interest rates. But the markets knew that this was an act of desperation.
We had a fairly strong sense that we were on to the kill. It indicated to us that we are in at the end game, that there was no, this was an act of desperation. So instead of restraining us, it was really an invitation to double up, to try to sell as much more as possible. So that afternoon, it became a veritable avalanche. A single government, like the British government, has practically no power in resisting these global powers.
Suddenly the Bank of England wasn't supporting pounds. Instead of a load of noise coming out of the voice brokers and everything and around the dealing room, everyone just sat in stunned silence for about 2 seconds or 3 seconds, and all of a sudden it erupted and sterling just free fell. That sense of awe that the markets could take on a central bank and actually win, I couldn't believe it.
So how many pounds have you sold?
About $500 million.
$500 million. So has it been good business?
Yeah, it's been really good.
What does that mean to the bank here?
We've had an excellent day. We've made a lot of money, so it's good.
What are we talking about? A couple £100,000?
Probably about 10 million.
To James Goldsmith, this was the evidence that the apocalypse was indeed happening. The global markets were destroying governments. Their next step in world domination, he believed, were the free trade treaties like GATT and the Maastricht Agreement on Europe. These treaties were being forced on governments by corporations who in turn were under pressure from the greedy markets. The treaties would give the corporations the freedom to move their factories to wherever labour was cheapest. In the process, treaties would destroy national identities and governments.
Who benefits? I'll tell you who benefits.
Well, they'll say...
I'll tell you who benefits. Let me give you the facts. The facts are the people who benefit are the big major corporations. There's a divorce between the interests of major corporations and of society. Now, how do they operate? They're no longer linked to the United States, the American ones, or to France, or to Britain. They operate by farming out their production to whatever country produces the cheapest labor, wherever they can get the biggest return on capital and pay the lowest part to labor. We will create, on a scale unheard of, mass migration. What we saw in Rwanda, 2 million people, will be nothing. So as to satisfy an economic doctrine. And the result is we are destroying the stability of our societies because we are worshipping the wrong God, economic index.
So it all began to fit together into a very clear picture for him where everything that had happened since the 15th century, all the economic theories, all the Enlightenment theories, all the Renaissance theories, had all come together to create a false economic system.
Goldsmith now decided to make a stand against the forces of globalism. At the end of 1994, he returned to Britain to announce he was forming his own political party. It had one aim. It would fight at the next general election to force a referendum on the Maastricht Treaty. He was going to give those who didn't want to be ruled by a global business elite the chance to reassert their national identity.
I will help them. I will guarantee that they have the infrastructure to put forward one candidate in each constituency. And I will guarantee that that party will be funded as well as any other political party to be able to fight that campaign, have a 30-day life, put through the referendum, and then resign.
Goldsmith's announcement caused a sensation. It was seen as a direct attempt to destroy the Conservative vote at the next election. And that very same month, the Major government received another body blow from a vengeful tycoon. From their old ally and supporter, Mohammed Al-Fayed.
A government minister resigns over the cash for questions allegations. Tim Smith admitted he accepted money from the owner of Harrods to ask questions in the Commons. The second minister, Neil Hamilton, denies the allegations and is suing for libel.
Doesn't it just show the present frenzy of ludicrous rumours that are sweeping around?
John Major sacks his Trade Minister Neil Hamilton and sets up an inquiry into standards of conduct in public office.
I shall, of course, be registering the biscuit in the Register of Members.
Fayed had been furious when the government refused to give him a British passport. In revenge, he revealed to The Guardian how he had given gifts and money to MPs. Fayed now portrayed himself as a noble fighter against the corruption of Parliament.
And this is a gift from me.
He conveniently forgot that he had been one of those who had tempted MPs.
Thank you. Have a nice...
The corruption of the political system and the corruption of the people have kidnapped those parties and changed them and changed their principles, right? Because those parties before 30, 40 years ago was ruled by decent and honorable people. But I am ashamed that such a great country and such a great people can just only put trash people to lead them and to guide them, right?
Major's government was rocked by Fayed's revelations. Many of the MPs he had paid and given gifts to had by now become ministers. It showed just how deeply business had penetrated into the heart of politics. And it was a process that was out of control. Even the man who had started it all had become worried.
I think it became very greedy. And advantage taking was very much the order of the day by a substantial number of members of Parliament. I can remember becoming deeply concerned about this whole attitude, the attitude of so many members, that I went to see the Chief Whip with the chairman of the 1922 committee, the Tory backbench parliamentary committee, to say to him, I think that a lot of Conservative members of Parliament are getting out of control. I think they are beginning to actually demonstrate signs of going over the top.
It was also a triumphant moment for Tiny Rowland. He had begun the chain of events that had forced Fayed into his angry exposure of government corruption. He and Fayed were reunited. Both had achieved what they wanted, vengeance. But in the process, two unscrupulous men had exposed how British politics had been taken over by the power of money.
We both felt time had come for us to get together again and put all the things behind us, which friendship. If the Israeli and the Palestinian can make peace, then the Egyptian and Loro and Tiny Rowan can do, isn't it?
They both have ended up by holding up a mirror, or if you like, a magnifying glass to our society and really showing us things that the rest of us didn't know were going on. Mohammed and Tiny were both people who were capable of corruption, but who paid people money, but they ended up telling great truths about our society. They are truth tellers.
30 years before, both Rowland and Goldsmith had been part of the Claremont Set, a group of reckless financial gamblers who had helped awaken the markets and begin their rise to power. But now, both of them, in their different ways, found themselves fighting against the force that they had helped create. When Goldsmith formed the Referendum Party, at its core were many of his old gambling friends from the 60s. Even Jim Slater's son stood as a candidate. Jim Slater was Goldsmith's closest friend. Back in the 60s, the two of them had begun the asset stripping of British industry. And John Aspinall, who had founded the club, also stood as a candidate. He and Goldsmith were trying to recreate a golden age when nations were powerful, not the markets.
The past gave him inspiration, not the future. He was frightened of the future, very frightened of the future, of the world, including England, very, very, very concerned and bemused, I would say, bewildered by the present, and his inspiration for what was correct and adjusted always came from the past.
Don't wake up on the 2nd of May to the same old Tories back again. Wake up on the 2nd of May to a new Labour government and new hope and new opportunity for Britain.
There it is, 10 o'clock, and we say Tony Blair is to be Prime Minister and a landslide is likely.
Martin Bell. Independent. 29,300.
Mellor David, Conservative Party, 17,108.
I would like to say that 1,500 votes is a derisory total. And we have shown tonight that the referendum party is dead in the water. And Sir James, you can get off back to Mexico knowing your attempt to buy the British political system has failed.
In May 1997, a Labour government was elected. But far from reasserting power over the financial markets, they did exactly the opposite. To reassure the city, Gordon Brown's first act as Chancellor was to give away the government's last instrument of economic power. He gave control over interest rates to the Bank of England. It was an admission by the Blair government that they couldn't control global economic forces, and there was no point in them trying.
What is called globalization is changing the whole nature of the nation state as power becomes more diffuse and borders more porous. Technological change is reducing the power and capacity of government to control its domestic economy free from external influence.
It would be totally dishonest of me or anyone to pretend that we can change conditions in a world market which alter the circumstances in which companies operate and trade. We can't do that.
The Labour government gave away its power and the markets rewarded them. Money did not flee from London as it had when previous Labour governments had been elected, and the boom continued. It has been the longest stock market boom this century. Many believe that because of deregulation, there is nothing to stop it continuing indefinitely. But there are others who are beginning to warn that all market booms come to an end, and that the global markets are becoming increasingly unstable. The question for politicians is, having given away so much power to control the markets, what happens when the bubble bursts?
I think the politicians have been put to sleep by the markets. I think if the politicians, particularly Labour politicians, delve deep enough into their psyches, they would admit that they are quite terrified by the power of the markets, by the extent to which these people are sitting on the top of a house of cards. Labour politicians know there is something a bit dodgy about this system, but the boom, the extent of the boom, the wealth it's created for parts of Britain, for the southeast of England and for London, and for a group of very vociferous, very powerful people, has actually lulled politicians into a false sense of security. What happens when the boom ends?
In 1997, James Goldsmith died. He had tried to stop the onrush of the markets and failed. And at his death, the business class who now dominate politics took him back as one of their own. And with them came the politicians who, in their different ways, had helped the market to take power. A year later, Tiny Rowland died. His funeral was secret, and no one knows where he is buried. The only remaining member of the tycoons from the Claremont set is Jim Slater. He still runs a business analysing the markets, and is fascinated, as he always was, by games of chance, even Monopoly.
It works out that Pentonville Road, Angel of Islington and Euston, they're the light blue sites on the left, give you 159% return and are the best in terms of arithmetical return. But the dark green sites, which people would think were better, Oxford Street, Bond Street and Regent Street, only give 101% return, so they're very bad. The next best site are the orange ones, which is Bow Street, Vine Street and Marlborough Street, and they give 141% return. But they are better than Pentonville Road, Euston Road and Angel of Islington, because there's an increased incidence of landing on them. You land on them more often. And the reason for that is there's a card in chance, go to jail, and there's a thing on the board, go to jail. And if you go to jail, you're past the blue sites and about to land on the orange ones. In addition to that, there's another card in chance, advance to Pall Mall, which does the same thing, it takes you past the blue sites. Another one, advance to Marylebone Station. There's another one, go back 3 spaces, which from one position lands you on Vine Street. So it's an overwhelming case for having the orange sites. Now, most people don't know that.